still seemed strange to me. And so I kept looking, and I started running across some things you may have seen that have been floating out there that indicated that maybe he wasn't really an intelligence virgin after all. And one of the documents that I published an article on a couple of years ago online was a document showing that 23 years before he was CIA director, he started an offshore drilling company called Zapata Offshore with a man named Devine, who was a CIA officer, purportedly resigned at the age of about 26 to go into the oil business with Mr. Bush. And of course, we know historically, and I know many people from the agency, and they've confirmed this to me, that this is just a standard thing, that if you're doing something where you need deniability, you quote-unquote resign. I mean, E. Howard Hunt had done that in the Watergate period, and yet there's clear indications that he was very much still working for the agency. So we have very serious indications that Mr. Bush was somehow working with the CIA all the way back when he was a very, very young man. And in fact, I've studied his company and I've looked at his travels and so forth, and there's no way, and I've been in business, there's no way that it makes sense from a practical business standpoint. He had a tiny company that leased just a handful of rigs, and he was going all over the world. It was almost frenetic. And later on, we see indications that he was stopping at CIA stations around the world, visiting with certain folks, and it paints a certain picture, let's say. So I was very interested in him. And then I became aware of certain other things, such as, you may have seen this, this was reported in Kitty Kelly's book and in a number of other places, that some years ago when the elder Bush was interviewed, and they were just sort of asking him benign questions. Yeah, he asked people about historic events and what they remember about them. So somebody asked him, and they said, "Do you remember where you were the day that Kennedy was shot?" And he didn't know. He did not remember where he was that day. And wherever I go, I always ask the audience, and we'll do it here, I guess, how many of you were 5 years old or over November 22, 1963? Okay. And of those of you, of that subset, how many of you do not remember where you were that day? Anybody? You sure? It's okay. It's okay. Nobody. Okay. Anyway, he didn't remember, and that interested me, and so I thought, well, I'm curious about that, and then I spent 2 years of my life trying to answer that question. The result is 4 chapters in Family of Secrets about the Kennedy assassination and about that curious answer. Because we don't have a lot of time here, I'm going to have to kind of race through some of the highlights here, but basically, there are 2 declassified documents out there, originally reported by other journalists, and they garnered very little attention. One showed that on November 23, the FBI had some sort of consultation at the request of the State Department, which claimed to be concerned about right-wing Cuban exiles using the Kennedy assassination as an opportunity, as a signal or something, to launch an invasion of Cuba. I mean, the whole memo itself is preposterous, and I do believe that a lot of these government memos are covering documents, but they have certain trace elements of truth. And so the mere fact that they created this document meant that there was something there that they were covering up. And so often the names of participants, at least, are significant. They're not invented out of whole cloth. This document said that 2 people were involved in this briefing with allied intelligence agencies, one a man from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the other a man from the CIA, and they named him, and it was Mr. George Bush. Well, if this document was correct, then this was the FBI at least signaling somehow, and we know there were complex rivalries between these agencies, and that they were signaling that Mr. Bush was in the CIA and was somehow involved in working with right-wing Cuban exiles who hated John Kennedy at the time of the assassination. I am seriously thinking now that that may have been some attempt by the FBI to sort of level the playing field in these internecine battles. But in any case, there's that document. And then there's another one. And so now we have the guy who can't remember where he was. Then we have the guy who should have remembered where he was because he was working for the CIA in something related to the Kennedy assassination. And now comes another document, and this is discovered by another journalist. Again, it's completely ignored at the time that it comes out. And this is a memo from the Houston office of the FBI, and it has a Mr. George, this time it's not just George Bush, it's Mr. George H.W. Bush of, whatever, 6226 Briar, Houston, Texas, of Zapata Offshore, and he's calling this FBI office in Houston. He's not in Houston, and I don't know why he's calling Houston since the assassination's in Dallas, but he's calling there, and he says, I'd like to offer some information. I'd like my name to be kept anonymous and not to be released to the public, but I may know who has shot the president. So I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, even before I go any further, here's the same guy, can't remember where he is, and in another one he's a CIA agent, and in the third one he's a private citizen knowing who shot the president. So I think, boy, that's pretty interesting. So I go a little further, and I start looking into this, and he fingers a guy in Houston, and he says, you know, I don't know much about him, but he's been talking about doing something president, and I just thought I ought to let you know. And by the way, I'm calling from Tyler, Texas. And he said, I'm gonna fly to Dallas. I'll be staying at the Sheraton, and then I'm gonna head home to Houston. If you want to contact me. So I started looking at that. And I spent months and months and months. And I have one of these chapters is only about this phone call. And it's called Where Was Poppy? And I go back and I trace this whole thing. I actually find a former aide to him. And I discovered that at the very moment that he was calling the FBI at 1:45 p.m. to finger a man as a possible suspect who he said he didn't know much about, his own assistant, Mr. Bush's own assistant, was at the man's house asking him to do some political favors for Mr. Bush, and ultimately drove him to the Secret Service offices to clear him. So I said, well, that's strange. I mean, why would his assistant be clearing the guy he's ratting out unless they're not really ratting him out? And of course, it turned out the man had nothing to do with anything. He was harmless, essentially. In fact, he was such a Bush advocate that he, even years later, after he learned that he was mentioned in this document, he was working on the Bush campaigns. So you wonder what that was all about. And the only thing I could conclude was the fact that the document said, oh, by the way, I'm calling from Tyler, Texas. And I thought, well, the only thing I could figure out was he wanted to make the point that he was in Tyler, Texas, which was anywhere but Dallas. And I thought, well, why would he do that? So I started tracing things, and I found a letter. Even though Poppy couldn't remember where he was, Barbara remembered. She remembered only in 1993, 94, as Oliver Stone's movie was out and everything. She suddenly remembered, and she puts out these banal memoirs, which contain a letter in there where she's at a beauty parlor in Tyler, and they hear this awful news and so forth. But there are little clues in the letter, and so I go into the clues in the letter. And she says we were on our friend Mr. Zeppo's plane, and I look him up, and I can't find a Zeppo except one of the Marx brothers. And so I keep looking, and this took me about a month, and then I realized she had misspelled his last name, and I thought, gee, you know, there's in the book. I wonder if that was an accident or not. But it was a Mr. Zeppa. And he was all connected with all kinds of interesting drilling operations all over the world. As a young man, he had been involved with the Rockefeller Bank and so forth, and he was very steeped in, let's say, elite circles himself. And so they'd been on this man's private plane, and it became clear to me that, you know, I wondered, well, okay, so he was in Tyler at 1:45 p.m. How far is Tyler from Dallas? I talked to people who had planes. They said, well, it's just like a puddle jump practically. You take no time at all to get there, particularly if you're going from Love to that little airport there. And then what he did was he showed up at 1-something to make a speech that had been planned in Tyler to a Kiwanis Club. And I talked to the man from the Kiwanis Club, and he did remember how just as Mr. Bush was supposed to get up and make a speech because he was running for U.S. Senate, another reason he should have remembered where he was, being an active critic of Kennedy and on the circuit right there in that area at the time of the assassination. So this man told me, he said, Mr. Bush got up and he said, I've just heard that the president's been shot, so I really don't think I should continue my speech. Thank you very much. And I said, what was his affect? He said, oh, he was really calm. You know, he was just incredibly calm. And then apparently he left and he went to this payphone and he called the FBI with this strange tip. So I started looking more into him, and I discovered that there was a guy named George de Mohrenschildt. You all probably knew who he was. I didn't know who he was. But I got interested in him, and I spent a year on George de Mohrenschildt. And there are a number of researchers who've written things on him. And so, of course, I looked at all of that stuff, and then I tried to go further. And I've written a whole chapter just on George de Mohrenschildt, who turns out to be a fascinating figure. And it has occurred to me that you can't understand what happened in the Kennedy assassination unless you study these figures. And I agree there are hundreds of interesting figures, and I agree I'm interested in what people did in Mexico City and New Orleans and stuff. But here you're talking about people right in Dallas who were directly connected to the most powerful people in the country. And it seems interesting to me how a lot of the Kennedy assassination debate dances around the very core of the thing, which is cui bono, who stood to benefit the most, who was in the best position, if anybody was, to effectuate something like this. And so I began looking at those people, and I looked at George de Mohrenschildt, and what interested me about him was that he was basically sort of Lee Harvey Oswald's favorite uncle, godfather, guardian angel, whatever you want to call him. You know those sitcoms where there's the guy who